Everybody we see today has a story. Everyone has a different story. People come from all walks of life from all over the world. A great number of people have made their journey to America in hopes of a different and better life. Let me share with you the journey that my family made coming to America, the types of trials they endured, and where we are now. My ancestors on my father's side made their journey from Switzerland to America during the mid 1700s. They settled in Savannah, Georgia. During this time, Georgia was unique to the other 13 colonies. Besides being the youngest of the 13 colonies, they were also the only colony without a governing body. This could have made for a much different living experience than what my ancestors experienced in Europe. Being that Georgia was a young colony, they were able to stay on the outside of the conflicts that were arising in the colonies prior to the Revolution. However, in 1779, the Siege of Savannah took place. In this battle, American troops attempted to liberate Savannah from the occupying British troops but failed, according to James C. Cobb of the University of Georgia. It is likely that this battle had a profound impact on my ancestors and could have affected their freedom and way of life. My ancestors made their living from farming in Georgia. Farming was a very demanding way of life and had its many ups and downs. Georgia's main crop was cotton, according to William P. Flatt of the University of Georgia, followed by tobacco. These two crops, and primarily cotton, helped sustain Georgia and move the economy forward. In the mid 1800s, the Civil War was fast approaching, and Georgia was right in the middle of the action. A few of my ancestors fought in the Civil War on the Confederate side. As mentioned before, Georgia's role in the Civil War was crucial. According to John D. Fowler of Dalton State College, Georgia provided an estimated 120,000 soldiers to the Confederate cause. Also, many of Georgia's political leaders at the time wanted Georgia to secede from the Union. It is unclear what kind of effect this had on my ancestors. It could have possibly divided some of the family. If this did occur, there is no doubt the impact it made on the family. Savannah also had a role in the Civil War as well, as the city was occupied by Union troops. Once again, this may have been difficult on my ancestors. There must have been a great amount of stress in their lives. After the Civil War, my family went back to their normal way of life, which was farming. At the turn of the century, Georgia's agricultural presence in America remained strong. A large majority of the state was involved with farming. My dad's grandfather, Grover Bruner, moved to Metter, Georgia, where they continued to farm. During this time, however, times were changing for the farmers in Georgia. Georgia's agricultural economy began to steadily decline. Along with the Great Depression, many different rules and regulations were placed on farmers saying they couldn't plant certain crops. The Great Depression was a very difficult time for the majority of Americans. According to Jamil Zinaldin of Georgia Humanities, the Great Depression hit and only worsened an economic downturn that began in the state a decade earlier. People not only had to do without, but they had to suffer through the Depression. There's no doubt that the Depression had its impact on my family. It wasn't until World War II did the Depression come to an end. My grandfather, Darrell Dean Bruner, was born near the end of the Depression. He was a very spirited boy as well as when he grew into a man. He was always after the next big thing. At this time in America, when he was a teenager, Americans were prospering. They made it through the Depression and were seeing much better times. In 1958, my grandfather met Joyce Brown, and were married the next year in Savannah, Georgia. At this time in America's young history, we were dealing with issues in Cuba and Fidel Castro was slowly coming to power. According to Stephen Ledman of Global Research, the U.S. established a trade embargo on Cuba where they banned the import of all goods coming from Cuba. 1 year after Joyce and Daryl were married, they had my father. He was born on June 23rd, 1960, in Savannah, Georgia. My father was the oldest of my grandparents' 3 children. My father remembers his childhood being somewhat tough. As I mentioned before, my grandfather was a very spirited and driven man. He wanted his family to have the best life. Often, this led him to not having much money and not taking care of the money he had. One thing my father was very fond of as a child were his summers spent with his grandfather and grandmother. Much like the rest of my ancestors, Grover and Ora Lee owned a farm. They continued to farm till they passed away in the late 1990s. My father grew up during the 60s and 70s when America was truly changing. Vietnam was taking place, and throughout much of the 1960s, my father nearly missed Vietnam when he joined the Air Force in 1978. According to Ronald Spector of Encyclopedia Britannica, 57,939 members of the U.S. Armed Forces were killed or went missing during Vietnam. Not long after my father left the military, he met my mother, Marcia Rose Hurt. The two fell in love and were married on November 23rd, 1986. A couple years after that, they had my sister, and then 2 years later, I came along. As mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, I believe my ancestors wanted to travel to America in hopes of a more satisfying life. Through the years and the amount of history that has taken place since the time they arrived, I'm sure they struggled at times to make it. They had their good times and their bad times. They suffered in hopes that their future extended family could live a full and satisfying life.